think we can go ahead and begin then. If you would like to take it over, Professor Renato, that would be fine.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Stump. Good morning, everybody. It's an honor. It's amazing to be here. No? So now I'm going to make the introduction, the presentation of Professor Morgan in Portuguese. Then we can start. Então, nossos alunos aí, antes de tudo, bom dia, né? Para nós aqui é um momento muito especial a gente poder estar participando, né, desse curso com o professor Gorman, né? E também dou boas-vindas a ele, né, com uma grande alegria, com satisfação mesmo, né? Quer dizer, que ele se dispôs generosamente a ministrar esse curso de introdução à metafísica para todos nós, mesmo por generosidade, e tendo sido convidado para isso pela professora Stump, né, ela está nos ajudando em várias coisas e é uma pessoa assim com um nível extraordinário, né? O professor Gorman, né, ele é uma figura de destaque no cenário filosófico internacional, né? É uma satisfação ter conosco alguém da sua categoria e conhecimento. Ele é professor ordinário de filosofia da Catholic University of America, que é uma instituição muito tradicional, de peso, que está sediada em Washington, D.C., né? Então, ele leciona lá desde 1999. Sua formação acadêmica é impressionante, né? O professor Gorman, ele tem doutorado em filosofia pela State University of New York, em Buffalo, né? E em teologia pelo Boston College, que também é um centro de excelência, né? Ele também tem um bacharelado em cristianismo e cultura pela Universidade de Toronto, que é um dos principais polos de filosofia hoje no mundo, né? A área de especialização do professor Gorman é a metafísica, né, com ênfase nas obras de São Tomás, né? Ele também tem um profundo interesse, para nós é muito bom isso, né? Na filosofia analítica, vocês vão poder contrapor com a maneira como eu ensino, como eu dou para vocês a própria disciplina de metafísica, né? E ele conhece muito bem a filosofia medieval e busca o diálogo entre a filosofia analítica e a filosofia medieval. Ele explora temas, né, como os conceitos fundamentais da metafísica, com destaque para a substância, para a normatividade e as suas aplicações em áreas como teoria da mente, cristologia, teoria da ação e ética. Então, vocês vejam aí, né, a abrangência dos campos de estudo do professor Gorman. Ele é autor de diversas publicações, um livro importante, muito reconhecido, que é Aquinas on the Metaphysics of the Hypostatic Union, um livro de teologia com base metafísica. Escreveu dezenas de artigos acadêmicos em periódicos de renome e é coeditor do livro Categories, Historical and Systematic Essays. Seu trabalho mais recente é um livro que eu estou lendo, né, com muito gosto, extremamente didático, pessoal, assim, profundo também, uma ótima introdução para a filosofia e para a metafísica, que é a Contemporary Introduction to Thomistic Metaphysics. Foi publicado em 2024, né, pela Catholic University of America Press, né? Então, estou entusiasmado com a leitura dessa obra, realmente, né, e ter tido a chance, a oportunidade do professor vir aqui falar de vários temas que estão nessa obra, realmente é imperdível para nós, né? Além da sua excelência acadêmica, o professor Gorman tem uma grande experiência internacional, foi bolsista na Alemanha, né, em Colônia, em outras cidades de lá também. Participou de um grupo da Fundação Templeton, uma pesquisa sobre virtude e felicidade virtude, felicidade e significado da vida. Então, esse curso é uma oportunidade excelente, né, para que a gente possa aprender com um dos melhores especialistas de metafísica da atualidade. Tenho certeza, né, que as aulas vão ser extremamente enriquecedoras e vão nos ajudar muito, né? Eu, para mim, me vejo aqui como um aluno com vocês, né? É realmente uma grande oportunidade. Então, quero expressar minha profunda gratidão, né, ao professor Gorman por sua generosidade, sua disponibilidade, né, sua presença na faculdade. É uma honra e um privilégio para nós, né? Professor Gorman, your presence here for us is an honor and a privilege, no? E também quero agradecer à professora Stump, né, cuja iniciativa foi fundamental para que esse curso se concretizasse, né? Então, a professora Stump, ela é, desde vários anos, uma das principais autoridades em língua inglesa no pensamento de Tomás de Aquino, né? Tanto pelo que ela escreveu, como pelo que ela organiza. É extraordinário o trabalho dela, a seriedade, que eu estou tendo a oportunidade de tocar, de conviver e ver isso no dia a dia. Seus livros são um marco na interpretação do pensamento de São Tomás a temas filosoficamente instigantes, né? Ela tem livros fantásticos sobre a dor, sofrimento, o mal, a reparação, sobre a justiça. Ela tem um dos principais livros sobre o pensamento de São Tomás, escritos em inglês, que chama-se Aquinas, né? Também agradeço aos assistentes da professora Stamp, Daniel e Menache, né? Foram aqui muito generosos conosco, estão dando todo o suporte, todo o apoio. Então, professor Gordon, seja muito bem-vindo à nossa Faculdade de Filosofia. Eu queria pedir a todos vocês, pessoal, que deixassem, né? Alguns não vão poder, mas eu entendo, mas em princípio eu gostaria que todo mundo deixasse aberta a câmera, né? O professor Gorman tinha pedido isso e realmente para ter essa interação, não? Thank you very much for everything, no, Professor Gorman, Professor Stump, who made everything possible for us, no, and for us, as I said, it's a privilege. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Very grateful for it, and we will now turn this over to you, Professor Gorman.
Thank you very much for that extremely generous introduction. Thank you to everyone for coming. It's an honor to have this opportunity to speak to you. And also, I'm grateful to all of the organizers who made it happen. I have to begin by apologizing for not giving these lectures in your beautiful language, but I can't. So trust me, it's better this way. The purpose of these 4 talks is to lay out some of the key ideas of Thomistic metaphysics. I won't be able to discuss everything. I won't even be able to discuss everything important, but I will at least be able to discuss some of the most important things. And I will particularly focus to some extent on topics that are related to issues that are also important in contemporary analytic philosophy, so that you can get a sense of how Aquinas's views and contemporary analytic views can be brought into dialogue with one another. So there's going to be 4 talks. The first one today, I will lay out the most important notion, substance, and a few related topics. In the second one, I will talk about the famous problem of universals. In the third talk, I will explore topics having to do with modality, so necessity, contingency, possibility, and so forth. And then in the last one, I will talk about how the role that God plays in metaphysics. For Aquinas, God is a much more important topic than merely what role he plays in metaphysics. But from our perspective, that's the thing to focus on. So that's what I will focus on then. So those are the 4 talks. But today, and you can see this perhaps up here, today I'm going to first make a few preliminary points. And then I will discuss the topic of substance. And I will try to show how substance can be an entryway into the topic of metaphysics. And then I will make an important distinction between the essential and the accidental features or properties of substances. After that, I will say that substances are not the only thing that there is in metaphysics. They're the most important thing, perhaps, but not the only thing. And then finally, I will try to explain why I think this topic and almost everything in metaphysics is so extremely difficult. It's not just our fault. There's something intrinsic to the very task that makes it difficult. But we'll get to that at the end. Okay. So, preliminary matters. First, I want to say just a few words about what philosophy is. I think philosophers disagree about what philosophy is, so you don't have to agree with what I say, but it will be useful to you to know where I'm coming from. So I think that philosophy is the attempt to answer fundamental questions using reason alone, or we might say unaided reason. So it explores fundamental questions using human reason alone. The word philosophy, of course, means a love of wisdom. And so knowing fundamental truths is what having wisdom means. So let me say a little bit about what I mean by these two issues, fundamentality and reason or unaided reason. So consider the following questions. Suppose, for example, you were learning the language English and you wanted to know the past tense of the word to swim. Now you would say, is it swimmed or is it swam? Now it turns out it swam, but it's a very good question because for many verbs in English, you don't change the vowel, you just add ed. So you say jump, jumped. But for some verbs, you say swim, swam. Why? Well, that's a good question. If you asked that question, then you would be asking a sort of deeper or more structural, perhaps, question about the English language. And then someone could give you an answer in terms of strong verbs and weak verbs. But then you could say, what is a verb at all? What is the difference between a verb and a noun? Now, here again, you would be asking an even deeper question. And then you could say, could there be a language that did not have any verbs at all? Could there be a language without verbs? It's a kind of an interesting question. And then, if you were continued in this mood, you might say, what are words in the first place? Why do some sounds mean something? And other sounds like flug, that doesn't mean anything at all. I just made that sound up. Okay. Now, if you were in a conversation that proceeded in the way that I just set out, going from one of those questions to the next, maybe late at night, sitting around with your friends, or sitting around a campfire or something like that, eventually someone might say, whoa, this conversation is becoming very philosophical. And they would be right. As you go through those questions, what is the past tense of swim? What is a verb? What are words? And so on. The questions are becoming more and more fundamental, more and more basic. And so I think that if you get, the closer you get to asking fundamental or foundational questions like that, the more you are engaging in philosophy. And if you're wondering, maybe there's not a sharp line between questions that are fundamental enough to be philosophy and those that are not, I think that's probably true, and that's fine. So very, very basic questions in linguistics probably are part also of the philosophy of language. Very basic questions in history are probably part of the philosophy of history. I think that's fine. Because everything eventually leads to philosophy. It has to, because philosophy asks the most fundamental questions. But now I want to say something about the other part of my explanation of philosophy, namely that philosophy uses reason. And in particular, now, of course, everything uses reason. But what I mean is reason alone or unaided reason. So the main point here is that philosophy does not rely on divine revelation. Now, if you think there's no such thing as divine revelation, then of course philosophy can't rely on it. But if you think there is divine revelation, still, it's not the philosopher's job to depend on it. Now, it's perfectly fine to have a field of study that depends on reason and also on revelation. This is called theology. So that's great. But philosophy is not that. Okay? So that's just my understanding of what philosophy is. Now I'll switch to the second preliminary point and talk about what metaphysics is. Metaphysics, of course, is a branch of philosophy. It's a part of philosophy. The word metaphysics comes from the words meta, meaning after or beyond, and physics, which comes from the Greek word for nature. So the traditional idea here is that you study metaphysics after you had studied the science of nature. So metaphysics, what makes metaphysics special and distinctive is that in a certain sense, it tries to study everything. Metaphysics is the science of being. It's the study of being. And so the way I'm going to explain this, well, here is a way to try to explain this. Suppose you start with some very specific sort of object of inquiry. So, for example, suppose you wanted to study squirrels. So this is what I mean. I believe this is called esquilo, right? So, okay. So we could have a science. I'm sure there are people whose whole life is devoted to studying squirrels and how they live and what they do. But if you wanted, you could have a study that was broader, that covered more. It would study all mammals, so all warm-blooded beings. Well, no, that's even broader. Sorry, all mammals, or you could get broader and study all warm-blooded, or all vertebrates, or you could study all animals, or you could study all physical things. So it would be not only squirrels, but also spoons and things like that. Okay, so every step that we make here, we're studying more and more things. Our target of inquiry is becoming more and more general. Well, if you make your topic of inquiry maximally general, you will be studying everything. You'll be studying being. So we'll be now, of course, everything that exists is a being. A squirrel is a being. But if you are a squirrel scientist, you study the squirrel as a squirrel. If you are a zoologist, you study a squirrel as an animal. A metaphysician studies squirrels as beings. So they're an example of everything, so to speak. So that's why we say that metaphysics is the study of being as being, or being qua being, if you like Latin words. So metaphysics studies everything. And the two main ways to do this are to talk about what everything has in common. That would be the study of the transcendentals. So you might ask questions like this: is everything that exists individual? Is everything good? Is everything beautiful? Those would be questions about the transcendental properties of being, we say. But also, you can talk about the main subdivisions or categories of being. So you could say, is everything, a thing? Or are the properties or features of things somehow different? They're not themselves things, but they're the properties of things. Or another question you might ask would have to do with events, like when something happens, like when someone gives a lecture, or when someone stands up out of his chair. That's an event. Is that somehow a different kind of category of reality? So these are the sorts of questions that we ask in metaphysics. Anyway, yeah, these are debated things, and you might now be thinking, oh, that's not my definition of metaphysics. Well, that's fine. I'm just explaining so you'll know where I'm coming from. Okay, so much for preliminaries. Now I want to get to the first main point, the main point of today's lecture, namely to talk about substance. It's very difficult in metaphysics to know where to start, to know which topic you want to explain first, because no matter which one you choose, you start to regret it and you wish you had chosen a different topic. But I think probably the best place to start is substance. And anyway, that is what I'm going to do. So in metaphysics, everything is either a substance or it is somehow related to substance. That's why I think it's a good place to start. But what do I even mean by substance? All right. So I'm going to mention 3 characteristics that substances have. First of all, they are individual, or you could say particular. I'm going to use those words interchangeably. So a substance is individual or particular. Secondly, a substance is independent. And third, it's unified. So individual, independent, and unified. So let me give a few examples. So a squirrel is a good example of a substance. A dog is a good example of a substance. I am a good example of a substance, and each of you is a good example of a substance. You are individuals. You are independent in some sense, and you are unified. Now, let me mention 2 things that are not substances. One of them is a stack of coins. Can you see that? It's just a bunch of coins here. Yeah. So this is not unified enough to be a substance. You can call a stack a stack. You can treat it as a kind of thing, but really it's just a bunch of things together, hanging around together. It's not very unified. Or you could take something else like this cup. You see its yellow color. The color, focus not on the cup, but try to think about the color. The color is not independent. The color exists in the cup. It depends on the cup. So that's enough for us to say that the color is not a substance. So I've given examples of things that are substances and things that are not substances. Now I want to say a little bit more about each of these issues: individual, independent, and unified. In fact, I could easily give a whole lecture on each one of them. A lot of very difficult points come up. I'll mention more about that a little bit later. So what I have in mind, first, by saying individual, the best thing to contrast an individual with is a kind or a nature or an essence. So like an individual human like Socrates is individual, and human nature or humanity is a kind. It's something general. It's not something individual. Or an individual horse, like Itajara is a horse, an individual, but horseness, horse nature, equinity, if you like Latin, is an example of something that's not individual. So that gives you at least a feel for what I mean by individuality. Now, let me say something more about independence. What's specifically targeted here is that a substance, well, of course, when you say that a substance is independent, you're saying that it's not dependent, right? So it's not dependent in the way that a color is dependent on the thing that it's the color of, or a posture, like right now I'm sitting, I could be standing. My posture in either case is dependent on me. It can't just be there without me. So a substance in that way is freestanding or independent. And then finally, an example of something like a stack of coins, it's pretty clearly not unified. It's not able to act as one agent. This is, I don't know, about 10 or 12 things. Each of them is doing its own thing, but they don't work together really as one thing. Whereas a substance, like a squirrel, can act as an agent. It is one thing that does something. Now, as I mentioned, each of these points could receive a lot more discussion. Maybe some of this will come up in the question period later on. But let me just mention one example. You might say that all substances, this one or this one, are dependent on God. That sounds like a smart thing to say, but then they aren't independent anymore, they're dependent. Well, okay, so the correct answer to that is to explain more carefully the precise way in which substances have to be independent. That turns out to be rather difficult to do, but it can be done, I think. So this is one example of how this gets a lot more complicated. All right, now let me just go back a little bit and touch again on the non-substances. I've particularly focused on dependent entities, like the features of things, color, size, shape, activities that they're performing, and things that are not sufficiently unified. So a pile of coins, a football team, things like that. A group of people, a dance group, a dance troupe, that's the word I want. That's a group, but it's not unified enough to be a substance. Okay, now, let me add one important point here. When you talk about the dependent entities like the features or properties or activities of substances, those are features or properties of substances. So in order to understand them, the features or the properties, you also have to think about the substances. So what they are is related to substances. So there's a sense in which then substance is prior to them. It's more fundamental than they. And likewise, when you have a team or a pile, a stack, you have a stack of things, of substances. You have a team of substances. So again, when you have these disunified groups, they're groups of substances. When you have properties of substances. So substance always is there first, so to speak. It's always the primary reality or the primary concept. And that's why substance is the primary thing. And that's why also we'll say quite typically that when we talk about being, we're talking about it. We're using that word being as an analogous word. Everything that exists is a being, but in different ways, in different senses. Okay. I hope that's coming through okay. These Zoom lectures are always challenging because it's hard to know whether it's making sense. But I'll just keep going, and then eventually we'll have the questions, which is always the most fun part anyway. Now, so I'm done. I'm going to move to here and talk about the distinction between essential and accidental features. Many philosophers accept a distinction between essential and accidental features. So, for example, it's essential to Socrates that he be rational. It's not essential to Socrates that he be married. It's not essential to Socrates that he be sarcastic all the time. He doesn't have to be that way. He just is. It's essential to a squirrel that it be warm-blooded. It's not essential to a squirrel that it be holding a nut right now. It doesn't have to. Okay, so some features are essential and others are accidental. Now, most of the time, most people would agree on which features are essential and which are accidental. But if you try to give a theoretical account of that distinction, difficulties arise. In most analytic philosophy, the difference between in most analytic philosophy, the difference between essential and accidental features is this. Essential features are the features that a substance has and that the substance cannot exist without. It must have them. It cannot fail to have them. If they are essential, then it's unavoidable that it has them. By contrast, accidental features of a substance are understood to be the features of a substance that the substance has, but that it can exist without. It's possible for it to be without them. So, for example, Socrates cannot exist without being rational, but he can exist without being married, for example. Okay. For Thomas Aquinas, and for nearly all philosophers who follow Aristotle, this is not right. It's not the correct way of distinguishing essence and accident. That's because philosophers in this tradition think that some of the accidents of a substance are nonetheless features that the substance cannot exist without. In other words, a substance can have features such that it cannot exist without those features, and yet, even so, they're accidents. So these can be called necessary accidents or inseparable accidents, or you can call them proper accidents or propria, if you want to use a fancier word. So here's the classic example. Socrates has the ability to laugh. He has the capability of laughing. He can get jokes. Now, that is traditionally understood to be an accident of his, but it's impossible for him to exist without having it. All right. If it's impossible for him to exist without having it, but it's still an accident, then it must be that there's some other way of explaining the difference between what's essential and what's accidental. So then the question is, what is a good way to understand them? So I will call this more traditional way the foundational theory of essence and accident. So here's a way to understand it. The accidental features of a substance are founded on or resting on or caused by other features of a substance. For example, you can ask, why does Socrates have the ability to laugh? And the answer will be, because he's rational. So because his ability to laugh rests on or is founded on some other, deeper, more fundamental feature of his, therefore that feature of being able to laugh is not essential. Instead, it's only accidental. But his feature of being rational is not founded on anything else at all. It's just the bottom line. It's the foundation. It's the deepest level. And so that means that he's essentially rational. There's nothing deeper about Socrates in virtue of which he's rational, although there is something in virtue of which he has the ability to laugh, namely that he's rational. So if you think about it this way, it will turn out that some of the accidental features of a substance are nonetheless inseparable from that substance. So this is one way in which a more sort of Thomistic or Aristotelian view is different from the standard analytic views. I mentioned that this is one of the ways in which Aquinas follows Aristotle. He's not alone in that. I would say that most of the medieval philosophers follow Aristotle on this topic. And in fact, I actually think it's all of them, but I'm just feeling nervous. Maybe somebody disagrees, but I think that's safe. On the other hand, it's important to keep in mind that Aquinas or the others don't always follow Aristotle. Sometimes they disagree with Aristotle. And it's a very complicated and difficult task to try to figure out when they are agreeing and when they're on the same team and when they're not. Aquinas gets a lot of thinking, gets a lot of his ideas from Aristotle, but he always thinks for himself, and sometimes he arrives in different places. Okay. I saw a hand go. Should we wait till the end for the questions? Is that better?
Yes, we should wait till the end. We'll wait till the end.
Excellent. That's fine. But it's fun to get in line. Okay. So now I want to switch to a new sort of topic. by saying that substances are not the only beings that there are. This, I think, is something that Aquinas would say. I think that trying to pin down exactly what he would say is pretty difficult. I've been working on this lately, and sometimes I think I've got it, and then I don't. But we can make some progress anyway. So for Aquinas, there are at least two kinds of beings. There are substances and there are accidents. Now, accidents, well, you can guess what accidents are. Well, probably you knew before maybe you knew before you came. But they are the features of things that are not the essential features of things. So accidents are treated as they are beings too. Substances are beings and accidents are beings. Now, the word accident is an unfortunate word. It sounds like something bad that happened, right? Like a car accident. But that's not what it means in philosophy. It comes from a Latin word that basically means to happen to. So an accident happens to a substance. Well, what could that mean? It's added to a substance. It's extra for the substance. It's not foundational. It's additional to the substance. It enhances the substance. It gives the substance more being or more reality than it would have had without the accident. Now, it's precisely for this reason, I think, that namely that the accident adds to the substance. It's precisely for this reason that the accident is a kind of being of its own. It's not just a different way for us to think about the substance, but regardless of how we think about it, something extra is happening. So Socrates is human, and let us say on top of that, he is wise. Okay? His being wise is more than just part of his being human. So his wisdom, his property of being wise, is itself a kind of being. Now, I think that is something that Aquinas would say, and it fits with things that he says about the categories. So he agrees with Aristotle that there are 10 categories of being. Substance, remember in the beginning I mentioned categories, it's the main subdivisions of being. So substance is a category, and that there are 9 different kinds of accidents: quantity, quality, relation, and so on. Now, so there are different kinds of accidents, and they're all different kinds of beings. Here's something funny, though. If accidents are beings, then you might suppose that they must have essences. So then accidents have their own essences. And that sounds funny. But I think Aquinas would say, well, maybe it sounds funny, but it's true. He says that accidents have essences. They have a special kind of essence, the kind of essence that accidents have. And what makes those essences special is that they contain a sort of reference or pointer to the substance that the accident is supposed to belong to. So there's a kind of incompleteness about the essence of an accident in comparison to the essence of a substance, which has a kind of completeness. And that's related to the fact that the accidents are dependent and the substances are independent. And if you know any Frege, this is related to, I won't say more, this is related to the things that Frege says about objects and properties. So now, oh yeah, sorry. Now, so now I'm going to start getting to the stuff that's very tricky. For Aquinas, substances are beings and they have essences, and accidents are beings and they have essences too. Of course, a different kind of essence, an accidental, incomplete, or imperfect essence, perhaps. I think Aquinas would not want to say that essences have essences. If you say that, you're going to run into problems, because then you're going to get into an infinite regress. If the essence of the squirrel has its own essence, then that essence needs its own essence, and then you just have essences of essences of essences. Okay, so that seems like a bad idea. Now, I used to think that the correct way to think about this from Aquinas' point of view is just to say very flatly and plainly that essences, natures, are just not beings at all. I used to think that would be the best way to say it. But it isn't how Aquinas says it. Sometimes he says that they are sort of, kind of, beings as well. This is a very difficult thing to think through. One of the things that he sometimes says in this context goes something like this. He says that substances belong to the category of substance, and they belong to the category of substance directly. And he says that accidents belong to their own accidental categories, and they belong to them directly. And then he says, for example, that the essential properties of a substance belong to the category of substance, but not directly. Instead, he says, per reductionem, by reduction, meaning that these items, the essences or the essential features, the form and the matter, if you want to think of that way, that they can be led back to and they belong to the category of substance in this secondary way. And so in a way, they're sort of like beings, but in another way, they're not really like beings. This is a difficult topic, and if Aquinas used this notion of per reductionem more consistently, a lot of problems would go away. But I don't think he ever stayed up late at night worrying about this topic. This is one of the many topics that you think of when you're reading Thomas Aquinas. And he thought of it too, but he didn't spend many, many hours thinking about it, as far as I can tell. He had a lot of other topics that he was interested in. So he has a whole discussion of whether you need to pay attention while you're praying. He has a discussion of that. But this question, which I would like to know the answer, I mean, the other is an interesting question too. But like, sometimes when you're reading him, you come up with questions and you can spend years trying to figure out what his answer is. I think sometimes you can't really tell. That's okay. That means that we just have to think for ourselves and try to figure it out. He'll give us some help, but he doesn't have the answer. I think this might be one of those cases. So, but somehow the essential principles of substances, and for that matter, the essential principles of accidents, are, in a way, they're like beings, but in a secondary way, even more secondary than the way in which accidents are beings. Okay. Now, what I've been saying for the last few minutes leads to the last point that I want to make. Which is why the question that I just asked about the principles, the essential principles of substances or accidents, why it's so hard to think carefully and clearly about these things. So I think that what human beings are good at is thinking about substances, or about things that, anyway, that are very like substances. We're good at thinking about squirrels. We're good at thinking about dogs. And we can describe them in terms of their features. We can say what is essential to a squirrel. We can say what is accidental to a squirrel. We're pretty good at that. But what we're not very good at is thinking about the features themselves or about the essences themselves. For some reason, this is just not what we're primarily good at. It's a little bit too abstract. It's very different from the ordinary kind of thinking that we do day to day, and it takes a lot of practice and a lot of patience. And when we try to do it, we are in danger of unintentionally transforming those things that are not substances, transforming them into substances in our own minds. We transform them into miniature small substances, mini substances, and think of them as if they were substances themselves. And then we imagine that the way you get substances is by having a lot of mini substances and you put them together. So I've got an example here. So let's see if I can do this correctly. So you've got these three pieces, you see, of a pen. And now each of them, in a sense, we can have an argument about this if you want, but it's like a substance, okay? And then you just put them together, and now you have a pen. Okay, so that's pretty much true for pens. But here's what's not true. You take some color and some shape and some warm-bloodedness, and then put them together and make a squirrel. If you think of it that way, it's easy to understand. And of course, it's nice when your theory is easy to understand. But this is one of these sad cases where the theory that's easy to understand is a bad theory because it isn't correct. And so in order to do a better job of metaphysical thinking, we need to purify our concepts and think of colors and shapes and so forth, not as if they were mini substances, but, well, in some other way. And it's in fact quite difficult to figure out how to do it. As soon as we do it, we start treating it like a thing. The philosopher Jonathan Lowe said, "Not everything is a thing." And that's a good slogan, but we tend to think of everything as if it were a thing, a substance. So this is, I just sort of say this at the beginning of these 4 lectures as a sort of warning. This is a way in which metaphysics goes wrong a lot. And unfortunately, there's no simple algorithm to follow to solve this problem or to prevent it from arising. Wittgenstein says that one of the tasks of philosophy is to prevent our intelligence from being bewitched by language. And I think that was a wise saying on his part. The way we talk tends to make us think that everything is a substance, maybe just a little tiny substance. But that isn't right. It's more complicated than that. But that just means that metaphysics is very difficult. But that's because philosophy is very difficult. But you know what? Life is difficult. So that's all I have to say for today. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing your questions and your objections. Thank you very much.